Welcome to Financially Speaking. I'm Shaun Latter. Love it or hate it, debt plays an integral role in one's finances. Now, although getting into debt is often unavoidable, how one manages it is often the all-important ingredient as to whether financial future ends in success or failure. Joining me in the studio to take us through the ins and outs of debt management are Raylan Dunbar, Financial Advisor at FinLogic, Peter Satar, Senior Manager of Education and Strategy at the National Credit Regulator, or NCR, and Paul Slot, Debt Counsellor and Director at Octogen. Before we jump into our discussion, though, let's take a quick look at our viewer's question for this week. It comes from Catherine in Craighall Park, and she says, I got into debt prior to 1 June 2007 when the new National Credit Act came into force. I'm still struggling to repay my debt. What recourse can I take under the new Credit Act? Firstly, good evening and welcome. Peter, I think I'm going to throw this one at you straight away. Just as a backdrop, around the National Credit Act, if you could give us a bit background on that and perhaps deal with the question at hand.
The National Credit Act is a consumer protection piece of legislation that was introduced in 2007 to primarily regulate the credit industry. Amongst its salient features is regulation of interest and fees, to provide and also to provide for debt reorganization in instances where consumers find themselves in over-indebted situations. It also provides for disclosure, as we all know that disclosure has been a sore point, particularly in the credit industry in South Africa. And most importantly, it makes provision for issues such as provision of credit in a much more responsible manner.
Okay, so it's responsible credit.
It's responsible credit.
It's all about disclosure, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Now, the question at hand here was really around if someone got into debt prior to that all-important date of June 2007, and now they're struggling to get out of debt, what recourse do they have under the Act, if at all?
The first thing, before we even get into the Act, is that as a consumer, if you're experiencing financial difficulties, your starting point always should be for you to approach your credit providers. In particular, go to your bank, for example, and present your story. In most instances, you'll find that credit providers are willing to help. And it's only when you cannot actually get assistance from your primary credit provider that you can consider approaching debt counselors. Even though credit was actually taken before the implementation of the Act, that's before June 2007, such debt are still subject to debt counseling, meaning a debt counselor would typically look at the case, see if the consumer is indeed over-indebted, and begin a process of actually negotiating on behalf of the consumer with all the various credit providers.
Okay. Obviously, being a debt counsellor yourself, Peter, really, what would you give as a point of advice for someone like Catherine?
I think that the first point of call is for that consumer to say, I'm in trouble. And the sooner that realization can kick in, the better. And what we see is that a lot of consumers wait a little bit too long. So I'm in trouble, I need help. As Peter said, go to your credit provider. If there's no assistance there, then go to a professional debt counsellor that can actually take you through the process to say, here's a position, I need some advice, take me through the debt counselling process. Understand it first before you enter into the process and see if that's something that you actually want to engage in.
We've spoken about the National Credit Act very briefly, the role of debt counselling, which I want to spend a bit more time with you on just now. But your specific role with the National Credit Regulator, where does the National Credit Regulator fit in to the National Credit Act and assisting consumers as well as potentially institutions getting this credit thing right?
Our role as the National Credit Regulator is to really implement this piece of legislation. From registration of credit providers, it's a requirement in terms of the Act for credit providers to register with us. Debt counselors are supposed to register with us, as well as credit bureaus. And part of our job also entails really doing research, collecting information from the industry, analyzing it and publishing it for the benefit of the industry, and most importantly, to use such information as a basis to inform government in coming up with its policies, etc. And lastly, and most importantly, consumer protection, to ensure that consumers are protected in this instance.
Now, consumer protection was something that I know we had a brief chat about before the show, because really what I'd like to know, and I'm sure a lot of viewers are looking at, is where does the onus lie? If I go to an institution and the institution says that I can, given the information that they've been privileged to, afford certain amounts of credit or debt, things go wrong. Where does the onus lie from a recourse point of view?
I think the first thing is that there's a dual responsibility. The consumer is always responsible for their own position. So they have to responsibly decide, can I afford this debt, before they approach the credit provider, or also in the process. Credit providers, on the other hand, also have a responsibility to say, is this debt responsible? Can that individual repay the debt? So there's a dual responsibility in terms of the process. What we often see happening is that the consumer would actually tell the credit provider what they think the credit provider wants to know in order to approve the loan. And that's where the first step where it goes wrong. Because if you tell it like it is to the credit provider, they can obviously take the information into account, what is available, and say you can or cannot afford the loan. So that starting point is so important in terms of the process, to make sure that I as an individual can afford it, especially if it's a second or the third loan or something. And the power to say no to debt is something that we still have to learn in this country.
The power to say no.
Yeah.
Roland, I mean, you work with clients every day on a financial nature. What is it that you're seeing out there from people exposing themselves to credit?
I think people are realizing, especially coming out of the recession from last year, they're realizing that it's not as easy to get out of debt as it was in the past. And for that reason, I think people are being a little bit more vigilant in terms of how they actually are applying for debt. One of the most important things that people have to do, though, before they think about applying for debt, is really to set out a proper budget. In terms of actually budgeting and having a look at what is the cost that something is actually going to, the total cost of something in order to own it. Now, it's all good and well to say, great, I'm buying a car for the absolute maximum that I can afford every month. But you forget about the fact that fuel costs are obviously going up. Tire wear is going to happen. We hit a pothole nowadays, and obviously you're in a situation that you have to replace tires. So there's a lot of additional costs that actually come up on top of that. Insurance costs, your licensing fees. And when those types of costs start coming through, people very often don't always know how to budget and how to get out of those extra costs, because they've absolutely maximized what they could afford to pay. So really, from a financial planning point of view, we really try and sit down with each individual, go through what their current situation is. And it's always good to have a second person's advice on your situation, because very often you might be able to afford a certain amount of debt. But if something does go wrong, you need to be able to have some kind of an emergency plan in place that, at least if there's a medical issue and your medical aid might not cover the full amount or something like that, at least you have the capital amount saved and set aside so that at least you can survive for a few months after an event. Also, things like your planning in terms of medical aid and that type of thing is very important. I mean, if a person, for example, loses their position or gets retrenched, that's not something that you necessarily know is going to happen 6 months in advance. So when it does happen, people have often already used up emergency funds, and by that point there's obviously even a worst case scenario. We find that they're dipping into their provident funds and their pension funds when they're leaving a company, and they're actually surviving on their retirement money. And the concern really from an advice point of view is that going forward, those people are now 10, 15 years behind in terms of their planning, and that's obviously a concern for us.
Sure, and I think getting back to one of your original points is really around the budget.
Yes.
Now, something that I know is from my point of view, where perhaps a lot of the credit checks and that take place, the institutions look at the current prime interest rate. Now, what I can afford now, when we're sitting in interest rates that are at not all-time lows of perhaps 35 years, versus what's going to happen in 6 months, a year, or 2 years' time when suddenly we have an upward trend in interest rates. That becomes all important. When you're budgeting with somebody, what is the type of buffer that you put in from a prime interest rate point of view?
Well, that's quite difficult. If we have a look at what the interest rates were last year in comparison to what they are this year, obviously people need to take into consideration that there should be a buffer. Now, in the past...
Because they can afford more credit
absolutely.
at the moment.
But in the past, what used to generally happen is that we use normally about a 3-4% buffer. But even nowadays, that's not necessarily enough. We saw what happened with interest rates last year. So it's important for people to actually keep an even larger buffer, roughly 5%, if not more. And the idea really is if you don't overexpose yourself, if you have an emergency fund in place, if you have correct saving structures in place as well, if and when the interest rates do go higher, you're obviously in a position that you are able to control those situations. You possibly have a capital amount that you can maybe pay off your credit card, which is a very high interest amount, and obviously save yourself from an interest perspective. So really by looking at a budget properly with a person, that actually helps us to forward plan for a person in terms of emergencies and also in terms of what could be happening going forward. Unfortunately, coming out of a recession, a lot of people also are not getting salary increases, which they thought they were going to get. So again, that starts messing up the budgeting and the forward planning.
Sure, absolutely. So I mean, a lot of it is around prevention rather than cure.
Absolutely, yes.
Sadly, a lot of people need a cure. From a debt counselling point of view, what are the type of options available to someone who's found themselves in debt and saying, where to now?
The starting point is obviously go to your own credit providers and say, can I restructure? That's number 2, and that could help. Number 2, in some cases, you can actually consolidate some of the loans that you have into a second loan or maybe in your housing loan. Although that's sometimes difficult because you're now extending debt over a long term and short term debt, so you need to pay a little bit more. But that obviously is an option. Number 3 is that what you can do is, I'm in trouble, I need to go to a debt counsellor, and the debt counselling process can start. And what happens there is that the individual will apply for debt counselling. The debt counsellor will sit down, and the first thing they'll do is that they'll revisit the individual's budget. And what we're trying to actually do there is say, how much do you need to live? Because we've got the simple principle to say that 35% of your income should be spent on household, 25% on financial service, and 35% on debt. When that person enters the debt repayment, and when that person enters the debt counselling process, their debt repayments in most cases is substantially higher than that 35%. That's why I'm in trouble, because now I'm paying 60, 70% or 50% on my debt. I don't have enough money to live. So what the debt counsel will do is redo your budget, determine how much money you have to live, compare that to what you should be paying in your debt, see what amount you have available, then with that available amount, then start the negotiation process with credit providers. Say, here's an individual, can we actually do something for this individual to reschedule the debt? The Act allows us to actually extend the period, and you can't play with the interest rates. But what will happen is that with the credit providers, maybe you can sit with them and say, but here's a proposal, is it acceptable to them? It's at their discretion. You actually work out a repayment instruction. It's submitted to the credit provider. They approve it. If everybody approves, you go to a magistrate court and you get a consent order. If not, you refer the matter to a magistrate court, and the magistrate court can then make a decision to say how to structure. That decision of the magistrate is then final, and that needs to be implemented. So it's a question of using what you have to restructure the debt, using future increases in terms of that pot to say, how can I repay my debt?
Okay. So I mean, quite a solid and sound process in place. I'm sure from a national credit regulator point of view, that's something that pleases you very, very much. And by the sounds of it, it's really about drawing a line in the sand, saying, this is where we are. We need to try and dig ourselves out of the hole. We're going to walk that road with you.